Pawan Chaudhary, an Indian writer, TV talk show host, and CEO. His most popular book is on wisdom, how a good man can win and really win. He is also known for his commentaries on Chanakya, Confucius, and Machiavelli. Pawan also hosts the TV show Hum Aise Kyun Hain on Doordarshan and has written columns for the Times of India, Gurgaon, and Financial Chronicle. He is the managing director of Vigon India, a French multinational in healthcare. Professor Bharat Karnad, with the Center for Policy Research, is consulted by the Prime Minister Narendra Modi and previously by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and over the years by defense ministers and foreign ministers. He has been a visiting scholar at the Princeton University, at the University of Pennsylvania, among others. His latest book on why India is not a great power yet is the talk of the town. His other much talked about book is Strategic Sellout, Indian US Nuclear Deal, co authored with P.K. Iyengar, A.N. Prasad, and A. Gopalakrishnan. Pramit Pal Chaudhary is currently the foreign editor of Hindustan Times and was previously the paper's US correspondent, following roles as editorial writer for The Telegraph and The Statesman of Calcutta. He specializes in India's international security and economic policy. Over the past several years, he has been a Hubbard H. Humphrey Fellow at the University of Maryland, College Park, Media Fellow at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, South Asia Fellow at the Henry Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and a visiting fellow at the Cornell University's South Asia Department. He has a BA in History from Cornell University and has visited over 40 countries and was born in Calcutta in 1964. Please note, you have been provided with feedback forms. We request you to keep rating our panelists and the sessions as we go along. Please feel free to take notes. Please park your questions till the question answer session at the end of the discussion. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I hand over to Mr. Pawan Chaudhary.
Thank you very much. Thank you, friends, for being here. Thank you, panelists, Professor Karnad and Pramit Pal Chaudhary, for joining us. So, the Blue Circle approach to communication, we will try to keep as truth well told. Truth told in a manner so that it is palatable also and it is constructive too. With that ground rule or attempted or our ideal in front, I'll move forward now. So, Walter Lippmann, Professor Karnad, Walter Lippmann said a nation has security when it does not have to sacrifice its legitimate interests to avoid war and is able, if challenged, to maintain them by war. Looking at geopolitics from this prism, do we feel that the previous government was overly pacifist? And is the current government moving towards militaristic nationalism? And if this is true, then what will be the advantage of this change in geopolitical orientation, and what will be the costs, if any? Bharat.
That's a very large question, but just to sort of get things moving, discussion going. I'm not so sure that Mr. Modi's foreign policy generally and his approach to international affairs is militaristic nationalism. I don't think so. Even if it were, I don't think the country is in a position right now, anyway, to afford it. But that said, I think we need nevertheless to be aware that with all the endowments and attributes of a great power, India hasn't made it in the last 70 odd years. We are still, in a very real sense, a marginal power, to the extent that anybody considers India a player on the world scene. It is as a regional, power of some slight consequence. But without the real muscle to do much harm to anybody. And it's precisely the harm aspect that one needs to um, emphasize, because whether anybody likes it or not, the capacity for mischief, the capacity for disruption is, in some sense, the metric for judging how, you know, judging a player. Um, and I don't mean to be simplistic about it, but consider this. Um, India has always wanted to be loved and respected. And one of the problems with that is that that's not the standard used by most states. People are different. They might laud India for its approach and outlook. But by and large, I think in the world of hard headed thinking, um, the fact is it's better to be feared and respected. And it is fear that I think we have always failed to inspire, given our own kind of advertisements of ourselves as a Pacific nation, as Gandhian, and so on. Much of it is hokum. I mean, we are no more Gandhian and non-violent than, and in many ways, perhaps we are perhaps the most violent society in the world, as any glance at any daily paper would suggest. So, one of the things is we have started believing the advertisements about ourselves. It's one thing to have advertise ourselves as something, quite another thing to believe our own advertisements about ourselves. And that, I think, is a great liability. The simple point to make, I think, is that India has been far too collaborative. Um, it has always sought to be part of a club. Uh, we always want to join somebody. And that has been, as I say it, my failing. I believe in realpolitik, hard realpolitik, and in some sense, that's the approach I take and have always taken. And I'm not much taken up by the notion of soft power and so on. If you look at history, um, soft power has invariably buttressed hard power. It's not the other way around. You have to have hard power first. It's because America has a globe girdling fleet and now a military presence that, say, Hollywood has its impact. It's not because Hollywood produces John Wayne films that US is great. You get the point. So, in our sense, in our case, we try to make it the other way around. That we have, Shah Rukh Khan and Bollywood, and we have great classical music, and lately Khichdi festivals and so on. This is not going to help us become a great power. Great power ultimately is the ultimate reckoning, whether you can keep your end up in terms of very hard power, whether you can hurt other nations. And that, I'm sorry to say, I don't want to sound bloody minded about it, but in a system of sovereign states, that's the metric that's invariably used. And that's where I think you have failed.
I agree with you. In fact, though I have high regard for Gandhi, when he says that be the change you wish to be in the world, I am reminded of another saying which says the sheep can take out as many resolutions in favor of vegetarianism, but till the wolf remains of a different opinion, non vegetarianism will prevail in the country or in the jungle. The second point which I thought was that, um, again from the animal world, I'm reminded of that if you think that the world will treat you fairly just because you are a good nation, it is like thinking that the bull will not attack you because you are a vegetarian. I fully endorse your point, but wish to bring in another point from it. That even the most well behaved and gentle of dogs have to snarl occasionally to maintain peace, which is the point which Bharat is making very well, beautifully made. I would like to ask you, in Doklam, did we snarl too long, 70 days? And did we snarl in the public view of others who were watching the embarrassment of the dragon? And will it have some consequences? Though I agree with 100% with what Bharat is saying, but I'm just asking you, can it have some consequences in the times to come?
Well, I think I'll make it clear as a Bengali, I'm by definition non-vegetarian. Um, the thing that I would say is that when it comes to China, um, India walks a careful path because, as the Chinese will always tell you, we are 5 times your size. And if there is any country in the world that practices realpolitik and virtually without any interest in any other aspect of international relations, it's the Chinese. Um, and so we have always, I think, over the years when I've dealt with governments and our senior most diplomats or even military men, they've always been careful of the fact or recognizing of the fact that China is in a position to inflict damage on India that at present India is not able to counter, except at the highest level, which would be at the nuclear point. So we've tended to walk back and forth when it comes to the Chinese, partly because of the memories of 1962, which I think still, many ways, defined our military strategy in a very defensive posture, arguably until very recently. And second, in recent times, when we see the enormous expansion of Chinese economic capacity, and now increasingly that's feeding into a military and diplomatic capacity as well, that India can, to some degree, beard the dragon in its cave, but after a certain point, there's always a sense within the Indian system that we can't push this too far. Um, but having said that, what is also, I think, important to recognize with the Chinese is that for them, partly because they hold India in a certain degree of contempt. The Chinese come to India, they see a chaotic democracy, a country that can't seem to build highways properly, and so on and so forth. They don't really see us as part of their, a major part of their threat perception. They are focused on, they're very hierarchical in their thinking. They see America as the only peer nation for them. India probably for them, I think, would argue, comes in at about a third tier level, or at best second, or sort of Russia, Brazil level of a country. And when my interactions, at least with the Chinese, I've got that very strong impression. The difference that we're starting to see is that one, India plays, I would argue, has been trying to play as much of its diplomatic cards as it possibly can, largely by trying to bring other countries into a similar fold who has share in increasing concern about China. And the number one country I think we've succeeded or we have seen that degree of convergence has been Japan. In the past 3 years, when I've talked at least to the Indian system here, they're very clear that Japan has proven, in their view, to be our strongest strategic partner. Japan has limitations, obviously, but on the economic side, and increasingly now a little bit more on the military side, we're seeing Japan align itself much, much more closely with India and with the United States. But there, the Americans have gone back and forth themselves because of their own internal debates as to how far they are prepared to take on China. I think in the Bush administration we saw it rise dramatically. We saw it sink under Obama. We're still not completely certain where the Trump administration is. I think Trump himself is unclear, but his foreign policy core, the Pentagon, State Department, and his national security advisor and chief of staff are very clear on taking a hard position on China. So what was interesting, I think, for me about Doklam was where we were able to combine, you saw China after a 5-year gap decide to push the envelope, as China does with everybody, including in the South, it did in the South China Sea, by resuming the construction of a road that it had stopped doing 5 years because of an earlier trilateral understanding between us and Bhutan. And then we responded, and responded both, I think, what was interesting is the Chinese would argue we shifted the goalpost by defending Bhutanese territory for the first time, which we'd never done before. And China responding with basically a lot of rhetoric. As we know, the language is unusual, even by Chinese standards, for their ambassador to come out so strongly against us. Then depending on who you think it is, I think the Chinese purpose was actually to rattle the Bhutanese more than us in anything, because if Bhutan had basically succumbed to Chinese pressure, and I know that's what the Bhutanese think, we would have been in a humiliating position of having Bhutan actually ask us to leave their territory. But we played our cards well, I think, on the diplomatic side. On the military side, obviously, we know what happened. And to some degree, when I talked to the Indian side, they expected what had happened in, I think, 86, 87, Somderong Tro in Arunachal Pradesh, where we had a similar standoff that lasted 14 months, if I remember correctly, that we were going into that state of affairs, as it is, partly, I think, because of the BRICS summit and the Chinese desire for Modi to visit. Well, Modi hadn't come to the BRICS summit, it would have had to be canceled. And the fact that Xi Jinping had his own party congress coming in, the combination of all of these factors, China eventually decided that it was better to back down. They demanded and received a face-saving gesture in that they would be able to say that we had retreated, quote unquote, and then they would adjust accordingly. So Doklam was diffused temporarily. The troops are still there, incidentally. They just moved back a little further. The question for us now is, having done that, and it's very clear, I mean, I know that Prime Minister Modi personally has told people that he sees this Doklam as a model for other countries in standing up to China. Because one of the reasons why China's been doing this is that over the past 10 years, nobody stood up to them. The South China Sea, Senkaku Islands, Mongolia, you see almost everywhere they have pushed hard and most countries have fallen back. And when America decided not to defend the South China Sea under Obama, that was the really big signal for the Chinese that they could really start pushing forward on their, not I would say territorial agenda, but the agenda that in Asia that they should be recognized as the dominant power. And it was interesting when the Pentagon chief, James Mattis, came to India recently, one of the first things he asked for was a detailed briefing from the Indian side about exactly how we had handled the Chinese in the Doklam crisis. How did it go step by step? How did China respond? What did you do? And so on. Because for the Americans and for many other countries, Doklam was interesting because, as what I've said, it was one of the first times it responded. The question now for us will be, where does the Indo-China relationship go from here? There's one school, I think largely centered perhaps in our intelligence agencies, which argues that we should expect a fairly strong Chinese response, another test of India sometime next year, because we've squabbled with them over the Dalai Lama. We have now become the most vocal opponent of the Belt Road Initiative, and we're actually succeeding there. You've now seen, I know privately, Germany has come in and supported us now. Japan is openly opposed, and now with Mr. Tillerson's visit, we saw America, which had been sitting on the fence until now, come out and say, yes, Belt Road is not a benign economic policy. It is a dangerous geopolitical game by the Chinese. And then finally, we had the humiliation for the Chinese part on Doklam. And people who've gone to China recently say there is a fair amount of genuine public anger in China over this incident, which indicates to me that Beijing has not decided to hide what happened in Doklam to its own people, which would tend to again signal that there will be some sort of Chinese response. The Chinese response may not be military. It could be a cyber attack. It could be some sort of diplomatic push against us. And it's something that we'll have to prepare. Another school argues that no, Chinese still basically don't take us all that seriously. And they will focus on, they'll have North Korea, they'll still have South China Sea, they'll have the unpredictability of a Trump administration coming in. So we shouldn't really expect anything. We probably won't have to worry too much about Xi Jinping immediately, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't keep your powder dry. But the Chinese, and I think it's interesting to note, they recognize that with Modi at least, this is a slightly different Indian government. And there was an editorial by the Global Times, which is a sort of nationalist arm of the People's Daily, which said that we must recognize that under the Modi government, I paraphrase, that this is an India that will not be concerned, this is an India that will not be concerned about involving itself in global problems and trying to extract what it can for its own national interest. And there was another op-ed piece which said, This is a government in India that will not be bothered about getting other countries unhappy about its policies. To some degree, that's a sign of respect from the Chinese because that's exactly how they function. But they also recognize this will be a slightly different India, and the question is, do they feel the need to actually bring India down a peg at some point later? And that's something we're going to have to see.
Wonderfully um, elaborated. Thank you very much. So, I agree with you that Z also in one of his speeches, the major speech which he gave, has said that we will not forget, the world should not expect us to forget to swallow those uh, those points which have hurt our interests, something like that he has publicly said. So in Assam there is a saying, आगे वाली गाय को शेर खाता है. Prime Minister Modi wisely is trying to create a chorus of snarls, as you said very well, and I think US is also coming to us, as you said, to learn how we countered China. Would US be, in times to come, Professor Karnad, be a good partner for us, a reliable partner, or there are dangers in partnering with US?
Just on the Doklam thing, I think let me just put in a slightly different sort of stance on it. We shouldn't overstate the Doklam success, such as it was. Doklam was a one-off in the sense that we had local superiority of forces. The terrain was very, very favorable to us. We held the high points and so on. So it would be best not to generalize from this one-off incident that in some way we got the better of China and that this should be therefore the prototype of actions in the future. That said, I think China is not really a 9-foot monster, anything of the kind. It has all kinds of problems. And therefore, in some sense, most of our diplomacy vis-a-vis China has at the core a certain awe of China. And this I've always said that you have our diplomats who are Sinophiles, who speak Mandarin and so on. And this is true of most people who speak the Mandarin language and learn it. They become Sinophiles rather than objective about their own interests, national interests. It's all very well to speak Mandarin fluently, and it does help your cause, but not when you come back to Delhi on station and then begin advising not to disturb the Chinese view of the world and this, that, and the other. This is what happens, not just with our diplomats, but also with our intelligence agents and so on that I have known over the years. And I found, to my great consternation, that they invariably end up plugging in one way or the other the Chinese line, which is what I am wary of. Having said that, the United States, unfortunately, and I've spent a third of my life there, so as the saying goes, all my friends are American. And what I've learned from the Americans is that in the policy context, foreign policy context, the national interest is about everything else. And national interest not in terms of how India has always defined it, in many universal terms, a nuclear-free world and so on and so forth, but in very narrow terms as to whether or not your interests are served in the here and now and in the immediate future. America is an extremely unreliable partner. There's a history of it I don't want to get into, but you have, I've written books on the unreliability of America as a partner. It's good to have America on your side, only because to the extent that our interests converge, it may be in containing China. But that said, for us to rely on the United States as some kind of a central pillar for our future approach to China would be a great, great mistake. And after all, it's not just Trump. Trump has just been more vocal about it. But think of what Obama said I mean, his first instincts were to set up a condominium with China. I mean, it's not to have democracies and who share values and all that nonsense, shared values. It counts for nothing in the world. Your immediate national interest, even if you have to sup with the devil, you will do so. I mean, in realpolitik, that's what you do. There's no idealpolitik here involved, because then you should not be in politics. And I always wondered why it is that the Indian government and Indian rulers, I mean elected rulers, who are ruthless in domestic politics, turn into billy cats when it comes to foreign policy. I wish they had shown the same ruthlessness abroad, in dealing with China, for instance. I mean, after all, what would make a greater impact on China? I've always said, and I've been advocating for years together, the simple thing of paying back China in the same coin. They have gone about deliberately to strategically discomfort India over the years by, for instance, nuclear missile arming Pakistan. I have, in my interface with the government over the years, at the highest levels, said, why don't we return the favor by nuclear missile arming Vietnam? Finally, we've gotten the gumption up to at least send the BrahMos missile to Vietnam, and then, to our dismay, find that the Hanoi government are simply so sick and tired of Indian procrastination over so simple a decision as sending a BrahMos missile. BrahMos is a cruise missile supersonic which is indefensible. If you fire two BrahMos missiles on a broadside, will bring down the aircraft carrier Liaoning or any other damn thing that ventures into its range. So this is the kind of stuff that we should have thought about long back. If you start with the BrahMos, fine, but go on ahead and nuclear missile arm the states on Chinese periphery. By the way, this is what I've said in 1.5 track to the Chinese, and they've literally been appalled at what I've said, quite apart from our Indian officials here being appalled by what I've said. But this is the way to do it. I mean, after all, consider this. A BrahMos is just sufficient to keep the powerful South Fleet of the Chinese Navy in the Sanya base. If you give it to the Vietnamese, who have given us a base for use, but we are not moving ahead with it, this is our problem. We just talk and talk and talk. We are not karmi yogis, we are karm talkers, we just talk, and just tire our friends and would-be partners. Do nothing over the years. We just talk. And so therefore, I despair at the prospects of India doing anything, even if it comes and hits you in the face. So that said, the point is America is not a reliable partner. History, and again, I can go on down why it won't. All that Trump's America, for instance, is interested in is selling you antiquated 1960s aircraft, and let nobody tell you differently. If you put on some 1960s aircraft with F-16 or F-18 vintage and dress it up with bells and whistles, it's still a 1960s aircraft when it comes to agility and the plan form. You can have a BVR missile, beyond visual range missile, arm the thing, and the military is my thing. And I'm telling you that if you talk to the Indian Air Force, that test pilots who have, during the MMRCA sweepstakes, flew the F-16 and so on, they came back saying, this is a ridiculous aircraft to buy. And that's why the first aircraft that were rejected in the medium multi-role combat aircraft sweepstakes that Rafale was selected for were the F-16 and F-18. Were rejected out of hand. Now, Trump is coming in through the back door to sell us this wretched aircraft, and giving a song and story about how, there's so many aircraft and this, that, and the other. Not true. There's sufficient material all out in the public realm to suggest that this is a commercial relationship which they want. They would have otherwise had to scrap and trash and junk the F-16 line at Fort Worth, Texas. Instead, they're going to sell it for billions of dollars to India. So yes, W.C. Fields, you can find a sucker every time, right? In business, you guys should know. What after all is, in business, everybody talks about how being disruptive is good for business, right? Being disruptive in business, having a new model, disruptive of the extant order. How come does not, in your mind, apply to international relations? It does apply, but we choose to be responsible. Responsible means what? Tag onto someone else's coattails or climb onto some bandwagon, and we have always done so. And this has been our problem, and why India is really not making it. And if we go on in this line, won't make it in the future.
Very, very well put points. In fact, I agree with you. Excellent points. This is a very informed audience, and I think now the debate as it is heating up, and I'll just come to you in a moment, Pramit. I fully agree with you, Bharat. We have not been courageous enough in geopolitics, and we have hidden our lack of courage with other hypocritical virtues. In fact, my study shows that this term Atiti Devo Bhava, it became most popular during those centuries when the invasions were becoming more and more. So we could not handle the Akramankari. We told him Atiti Devo Bhava. He was marching into our drawing room. So we were dressing up our base deficiencies in godly virtues. So I fully agree with you. However, I would now like to sharpen the debate between you and Pramit. Pramit, what Bharat has said, don't do what the Americans preach. Do what they do. They are extremely real politics savvy, self-centered administration country. That is one point. I would like to have your comments on this. And the second is, he said that Doklam war was one off. Do you agree with this, or you feel it was a turning point?
Okay, well, first on the Americans, I agree. America is unreliable insofar as any great power is unreliable, as is we are, incidentally. You go to Bangladesh, you go to any country that has dealt with us, there were a long litany of complaints about how India has gone back and forth, never fulfilled its promises. I once went to Myanmar with Manmohan Singh when we did our, essentially began a renewal of our relationship with Myanmar. Um, and I remember we made a normal set of announcements about what we were going to do, and I met some Burmese officials, and I said, "So, what's your view on this?" They looked at it and they said, "Since 1950, India has never fulfilled a single promise you have made to our country, not one. No road, no dam, no port, no military equipment, nothing. You have the worst record of any country we've ever dealt with diplomatically because you've kept changing your positions, and what you say now, 6 months later, you change your view." Now we can go into why, but the point is all governments, all superpowers, any superpower in particular will do this, but great powers generally change their positions quite radically. The game is that for a large country, especially one like the United States, is try to get a sense of what their overriding geopolitical interest is, see where you converge, ride as long as you can with it, but understand that this is going to change. And then exploit what you can out of it. They play the same game and they assume this other side will do the same thing. So, for example, we had a very good relationship with at the height of our relationship historically with the U.S. was in the late Eisenhower Kennedy period. It wasn't built on any Kennedy-Nehru relationship. It was built on a common concern about communist China, or Maoist China. We see it collapse under the Johnson administration, not because LBJ and Nehru didn't like each other. It was because Vietnam consumed the United States, and they expected India to join, and they were not prepared to give us the defense arrangement that they were wanted to do with Pakistan, because they said we can't give it to both of you. So India said, well, screw you, then we're off to the Soviet Union. Then the relationship deteriorates or reaches its nadir under Nixon because he sees China and he uses China strategically against their primary enemy, Soviet Union. Soviet Union's collapse. We then move back closer to the United States because we need a source of weapons. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and especially during the Yeltsin period, it was incapable of almost giving anything or didn't want to give us anything at that point. So, for example, we resumed our relationship with Israel, which we had basically thrown into a garbage bin years ago, and we went back to the United States. And it's gone back and forth since then. So under Bush, we see a man who and I've met Bush, deeply, deeply disliked China and saw India as the country that he was prepared to do pretty much almost anything India wanted. Um, then we had, as Bharat has correctly said, Obama, who comes in and a good liberal internationalist, thinks what I should really be doing is trying to cooperate with China on things like climate change and the so-called G2 policy that lasted about 14 months, my friends in the Obama administration, because China wasn't even interested. China said, we don't have to work with the United States. We are the number one. We will be the number one power, so we don't have to work with you. So Obama then begins to shift the policy again. But we continue, for example, the continuity of difference between us and the United States and Afghanistan, Pakistan, has more or less stayed the same. It's gone back and forth, just brief periods after 9/11, for example. It's now coming back into a degree of convergence. Under this administration or the Trump administration, after a certain degree of uncertainty, we can start to see the Trump administration moving into a policy that we see a convergence on the Western Pacific. However, we still see a certain degree of difference in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and we still have a lot of difference between us and Trump, for example, on trade and investment policies. Again, you play your cards where you feel you can. The point ultimately, though, is for us is that if China is going to be our primary geopolitical challenge, we are still not strong enough, just on the basis of economics, forget about anything else, to be able to take on China by ourselves. We still struggle to counter Chinese influence in our neighborhood, forget about in the South China Sea or the Western Pacific, but even in places like Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives, India, it's a huge battle. Sri Lanka, it's been a huge battle for us, continues to be a battle to keep the Chinese influence at a certain level. So then you need to play as many friends as you can, as much as you can, even if it's 50% here, 20% there, 30% there. And so Japan has been one of our biggest friends, but keep this in mind, the Japanese have also gone back and forth. The Democratic Party of Japan, the present opposition party, when they came to power, were pro-Chinese. Luckily for us, the Chinese despise the Japanese so much, they said, we don't care. Even if you're pro-Chinese, we still hate you. So the Japanese, okay, this is not going to work. We have to go back and go back to the policy. So now there's a continuity of policy in Japan, a consensus that they have to build up rivals to China. And they've selected India because it's an obvious person to work with. Bharat mentioned Vietnam. It's interesting. When I've worked with the Vietnamese, two things that have struck me about the Vietnamese. There is a very strong pro-China group within the Vietnamese Communist Party. Some of you may remember Tata Steel tried very hard to set up a $5 billion steel plant in Vietnam, and Indian government made it clear to the Vietnamese, this is going to be a litmus test of our relationship, that you allow Tata to put in a big economic footprint in your country. Vietnam said, fine. Nothing happened. And when I went there and I talked to Tata Steel executives in Vietnam, they said the Chinese are all over the place lobbying against this. And we lost. So all of Vietnam's problems with the Chinese on the South China Sea, the support of the Vietnamese military, Chinese business interests were able to stop it from happening. After that, the Indian side said, okay, we're not so certain you've made up your mind about China yet. Continues to be a problem. BrahMos missile, one of the reasons we couldn't do this, especially in the early phase, was because Russia, which is the other partner, basically said we're not interested in getting on the wrong side of the Chinese, and we're not going to support the sale of this missile. I remember I've been to the BrahMos factory in Bombay, and I've asked them. They said, "Why aren't we giving this off?" They said the Russians have come in and said, "No, we have too many stakes with the Chinese." So, you know, it's often a very complicated game in which you have all these little pieces playing, and your skill really lies in being able to move and also be able to judge where these pieces are moving. And it's not easy. I mean, I do this as my part of my living, as my job, and I get confused because you can just be sick. Nowadays, in particular, with the decline of American, should I say, not so much American power as America's will to use that power, and the rise of China, you see a lot of countries changing their policies at a remarkable rate. And within each country, you will often find two or three factions coming up and having different points of view. Australia. Australia has been America's most loyal ally historically. Every single war America has fought in recent history, Australia is the only Western country that has always fought along with them. Even in Vietnam, no other Western country joined Americans in Vietnam. Australians did. But we look at the Australians, and one of the reasons we are very reluctant to allow them either into the so-called trilateral, and we're now making it quadrilateral, or into the Malabar exercises, naval exercises, has been the fact that we look at Australia and we see a very strong pro-China group within the Australians. And the Australians have been complaining incessantly, saying, how can you seriously believe Australia, of all countries, would ever do something against Western values? And we're saying Western values, as Bharat is correct, values don't matter. In this case, it's about money and influence, and we see a lot of Chinese influence in your country. So we have our worries as to whether or not we can allow you in, and we basically put tests for the Australians to pass. But this is the kind of game that the uncertainty with which we have to play. But one of the things I will say, America is still overwhelmingly the most powerful country in the world. And in terms of technology, it is so far ahead, definitely ahead of the Chinese, who still can't even build a jet engine. And the Chinese are the first to admit it when you talk to them, that to not be able to play an America card would be a serious mistake. In fact, the reason why we can get the Israelis and the Japanese to help us, and both countries are very clear about this, I'm on a track 2 dialogue with both of them, both of these countries, and I have been for the past 10 years, is that they make it clear, you have to have the Americans blessing our relationship, otherwise we cannot move forward beyond a certain point.
Very, very well put. I think what you're saying is play the America card, but do not let your hand depend only on it. Very good point. I will open the discussion now to questions, and I have several more to ask both of you, which I'll ask at maybe later. But questions, please. Mr. Brar. Mike.
I just wanted, it's a question as well as a statement. I feel that it's very important for India not to play the card of showing values to the rest of the world, and which we have been doing. You know, we've been very worried that what the world will think in acting strongly in various matters like Kashmir and various other. But coming to the point of relationship with America, I don't really agree that it's an unreliable partner. The reason is we have some common interests, very strong common interests. America and Trump are against Pakistan. They are also not supportive of China, and therefore it makes a common objective. And I think if we play a card of carefulness with America, it'll go against us. We must aggressively and openly build relationships with them and take them as a strong ally. And I think a kind of Japan, India, America, and perhaps Russia, at some stage they were also keen to join in. If we have these not primarily as an anti-China point, but as a cooperation for various things which could incidentally also be to counter China, then perhaps it would be a good move. So I'd like your comments on this.
Yeah, I was wondering when the Pakistan thing would come up. Please, I think it's a pathology, it's a partition pathology, if I may say so. I'm post 1947, so I don't understand it. And most of us, I think, are, and I simply don't understand it. Pakistan, I do not see how, objectively speaking, it's at all a threat. As far as I'm concerned, I'm a military analyst. It was never a threat. It is not now a threat. Can never be a threat. The GDP of Pakistan is 1/6 to 1/7 of the market cap of the Mumbai Stock Exchange. Please, unless we have a perspective and we've got such fundamentals wrong. I'm hardly surprised we are nowhere in the picture. When you think of Pakistan as a threat of any kind, leave alone credible, it reminds me of the Panchatantra tale. An elephant might jump on a stool when it espies a mouse. That is not the mouse's problem, it's the elephant's problem. When you are spooked by a Pakistan, we have a problem. Because people virtually laugh at you. The reason why, should I be absolutely honest? The reason we are not taken seriously in international circles, I'm sure. I think I've been in the business slightly longer than Pramit here. I'm sorry, but we have no credibility. When you talk of Pakistan as a threat, and we then try to, slap along with China and try to have a concert with China, all this nonsense. Look, what was our basic problem? Our basic problem has been that our strategic problem is that we've lost the unitariness of the strategic space with the partition in 1947. That's true. Now, what happened was the pathology is taking over. It's basically a North Indian thing, and I'm a South Indian, Central Indian you might call it, so I don't give a damn about this North. And my wife is a Punjabi, by the way, and with my mother-in-law from Dera Ghazi Khan. So I'm quite aware of this sort of nonsense across the dinner table. But the point to make very simply is this. We've lost the unitary space. How do you regain it? For 30 years, I've been advocating a very simple way of doing it. And in all my books, and therefore these are things that upset people, bureaucrats, and there are vested interests now that have grown around policy positions in the military, in the MEA, all over in the Indian government, in the intelligentsia, and so on, and in our business classes, which is that the point I've advocated is, first of all, you have to begin to address the lack of trust of all our neighbors. This is something that Pramit would join me in confirming. Not one neighbor is friendly to India. There's a reason for it. We tend to be pro-consular in our attitude to our neighbors. But you bring in a slightly consequential power like China into the picture, and we have a tails between our legs. And that's the honest truth. This is not how you gain respect. Pakistan, I've said you can remove all the army from the western border and the Pakistanis can't do a damn thing. Cannot do a damn thing. I've suggested remove unilaterally the nuclear-tipped missiles out of our western border as a unilateral measure to gain trust. Remove most of the, I've said, again, in official records, I was advisor defense expenditure to the 10th Finance Commission India. It's not a statutory body, it's a constitutional body. And because it's now 20 years old, I can say it, I suppose there's nothing classified about it anymore, is that, and because the army is moving towards, in some sense, I'd said demobilize the three-strike clause, which to any Pakistani, to any sensible Pakistani, would be extremely threatening. Especially because you can't ever use it now with the Pakistanis getting the nuclear weapons from China, courtesy China. So, if you're not going to ever use the three-strike clause, why are they there? Which takes up, in my analysis from those times, and it's not very different now, the arithmetic is the same virtually, which takes up 26% of our defense budget. That's an enormous waste. Sure, you want to protect yourself against a Pakistan contingency? Sure, do it. Have one rationalized, compromised, I call it a composite core. It's in great detail, it's there in my writings. You have composite core, more than enough for any Pakistan contingency. But otherwise, get on with the business. As to the terrorism issue that everybody gets worked up about, and Vikram Sood is here, former RAW chief. I'm sorry, but I mean, here I would perhaps have disagreed with Vikram over the years. Pakistan, to the extent that it utilizes an asymmetric means of discomfiting India, it will, as a weaker power. And I have said that is so because Pakistanis, in some sense, as co-legatees of Arthashastra and Kautilya, are better practitioners of Chanakyan politics than we are. What does Kautilya say vis-a-vis undermining a superior power, adversary that you face? Use asymmetric means, like terrorism. I mean, Kautilya doesn't say. What he does say is, use any means to discomfit your stronger adversary. Now, sure, okay, you want to do, if Mr. Sood's RAW agency has to be given a task and they want to undermine Pakistan, Balochistan, okay, go ahead and do it. This is what Arthashastra says as Kutayuddha, covert warfare. Don't talk about it. And by the way, most superior nations always have covert warfare, prosecute covert warfare, even against the best friends. Are we aware that the most intensive Central Intelligence Agency operations were against which country? Britain. Do you know that? The best Langotia ayahs, transatlantic cousins. The biggest counterintelligence, biggest intelligence operation mounted by the United States in its history of intelligence operations was against the UK. So again, there's no need for the Prime Minister to, from the ramparts of the Red Fort, speak about Balochistan. We have given away the game. We have to become a little wiser in use of hard power and understand when to speak of things and when not to speak of things. And this is not something to be spoken of.
So what Bharat says, just a moment, what Bharat says is that if you see an elephant getting startled and scared by a mouse, he can bet on it, it is an Indian elephant. Okay. Second point, just coming back, Pramit, because Pakistan question is very important. Is wealth the decisive factor in war? And if yes, how did Alexander defeat Darius, who was far more wealthy? Or you feel other points are also important, like arms and the will to fight, or let me say the grace to fight. This is just to move it forward, and then we come back to the questions. Pramit, quick answer.
Well, economics is definitely very important. Without it, you basically don't have the capacity to fight. But it's economics, it's technology, it's the professionalism of your military. And as you correctly said, ultimately it's also about political will. You have to have the will to actually push these things through. And so, yeah, I mean, but economics is a very important part of it, as we, military economists, if you wish, like Gordon Wright and others have pointed out in World War II. One of the things that eventually, the Germans were actually better fighters, man for man, than almost all the Europeans and even the Americans that they took on. They had a much better military tradition and much better military capacity. And when they were fighting equal, 50-50, the Germans would normally win. What eventually overwhelmed them was simply the fact that the huge amount of economic productivity of the Western democracies. By the end of World War II, Britain alone was generating more industrial capacity than Germany was alone, and that didn't even include, of course, the Soviet Union and an enormous American economic machine that came into it. But that's definitely crucial, but it's not the only thing.
Very good point. Tijori is as important as the tank, please.
Two questions. The first one is that clearly China is a bigger threat, and China historically as well as currently has been kind of bringing India through a string of pearls. And the One Belt, One Road initiative is yet another way of, is something which we are not comfortable about. We have managed to get the others also onto our way of thinking regarding the threat from this. So even the developed world thinks about that the counter to this could be an Iran-Afghanistan route, or even from our side, linking up with Iran. Now, even as we are playing with the Americans, with what is currently happening with the Trump administration, how do you see, we playing the Iran card, or do we see potential problems there? That's number one. Number two is a slightly unconventional question, which is China historically, if you see, it's been actually angling for its growth through an investment led strategy. And a large part of it, like the Japanese had done initially, was investing heavily in infrastructure. The consumer demand didn't probably keep up with the pace. They were seeing signs of slowdown, and that's how they've, one of course has been the tying up of commodities, etc., through investing in overseas markets. Now they're also building infrastructure overseas. Part of it is the security thing, but from an economic perspective, obviously it's a very opaque economy, but do you see this imploding at some point of time? Because the economic fundamentals at some point of time have to work, play as per the economic rules.
Directing it to Pramit, please.
Um, well, yes, India tries to keep an open door to Iran, to Israel, and to the United States in all of this. And I know, at least when we've talked to the Americans, we've strongly urged them to maintain a relationship with the Iranians. And in the case of Trump, that has failed. Under Obama, he was interested in a nuclear deal. We'll see. There's still a hope that the nuclear deal will survive, but we have to see what happens on that. Irrespective of what happens on that front, India will continue to engage and is continuing to engage with Iran and trying to set and has revived one more time the North-South corridor. But the Chabahar port is now actually physically active. It's actually building. We actually do have a link at least to Afghanistan. The North-South corridor is a much more complicated thing because that will go all the way up into Central Asia, and we'll see how far. I'm skeptical about the North-South corridor, but I would also argue that it's not as important as it used to be. The mineral and oil and gas resources of Central Asia, in a world really aflush with oil and gas, are not that big a deal anymore. And anyway, China's presence in Central Asia is now so overwhelming, there's not all that much I think we can do there. And I would prefer that we focus more on the Indian Ocean area. The second question was on, the Belt Road Initiative. Now, the Belt Road Initiative has been interesting. I've been trying to monitor this along with a number of other people. And for me, it's about finance right now. China is very good at arguing, and Sun Tzu is very clear on this, that you defeat your enemy through getting into his mind. Fighting is really your last resort, and because fighting really is just is a sign that you failed. Power really lies in the ability to exert control without actually using military power at all. And the Chinese have recognized they have two very powerful capacities. One is to build infrastructure, and the other is that they have huge amounts of money. And so in the Belt Road Initiative, what has been interesting is their use of finance to slowly bring countries under their control. So in Sri Lanka, we saw exactly this happen. They had Rajapaksa who was unhappy with India because of our insistence on a Tamil political settlement. They basically said, okay, we'll offer you a giant amount of investment in your country and a lot of it in your parliamentary constituency. Once the money was handed over to him, a portion of that, roughly $300 million, given to the Rajapaksa family to win him over. And then basically they began to change the rules of the investment and convert it into debt. When the Sirisena government comes to power, and the final step with Rajapaksa is that they say, now you change your foreign policy. We've given you all this money. We've made you independent of India. And then that's when the Chinese nuclear-powered submarines began arriving in Colombo. which was the red line for India to move in and try to remove Rajapaksa via the Sirisena coalition. Sirisena's problem now is that he's got, what is it, $8 billion worth of debt at 6% interest, because the Chinese have now jacked up the interest rate and have basically said, you're trapped, you can't go anywhere. But it was a pattern that was already visible in Laos. They'd done the same thing. They did it in Cambodia. They're doing it in Europe, in Hungary, for example. And now, curiously enough, and the Chinese are ruthless at this. They're doing the same thing even with their ally Pakistan. They're building the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor was initially announced as 50% grant, 50% loan. It is now 90% loan. Commercial rates of interest. Pakistan's balance of payments is collapsing. If you saw in the last IMF World Bank meeting, the IMF warned Pakistan, you have now a situation where your exports are dwindling, a huge rush of Chinese imports is coming in, your FDI is now down to $1.5 billion, of which $900 million is only from China. The Pakistani Federation of Chambers of Commerce said, what are we getting out of this? Because none of the contracts are coming to Pakistani companies. They're all going to Chinese firms. And when the deputy governor of their central bank publicly complained that we are now paying for this entire CPEC out of our money, the debts on our books, we're getting no contracts, we're getting no jobs. Why are we having China build this? We can just do it ourselves. We'll get more money out of it. He was promptly sacked. 3 weeks later, he lost his job. Pakistani economists who denounce CPEC now come to India to make their lectures because they're too scared to do it in Pakistan. But the Chinese are ruthlessly using, for them it's really the finance slowly picking up countries using finance. So for us in India, the game was that we have two weaknesses. We're terrible at infrastructure. We can't build infrastructure in India, let alone overseas. And we don't have that much finance. So what do we need to do? So the Japanese have been our ally on the finance side. When we're going to places like Africa, Bangladesh, Myanmar, it's the fact that the Japanese are in the room with us that gives us credibility now. So we say, we'll build that corridor for you, we'll build this bridge, we'll build a port. Everybody looks at the Indians very skeptically, but then they notice the Japanese are behind and saying, we'll finance, we'll provide the technology, our companies will build it. And they say, okay, now we are serious. But now we're trying to get other countries. The German foreign secretary was here 3-4 months ago and I had a chat with him, and he says, we accept we made a mistake. We also thought the Belt Road was benign. We now accept that that's not the case at all. Even in Europe, in Hungary, we can see the Chinese using the Belt Road to essentially capture power, using Viktor Orban and promoting him against the EU, that this was a mistake. And now we are more or less on alignment with you. The Americans also, when Trump came to power, the first time I met a member of his National Security Council, they said, oh, what's wrong with CPEC? It'll bring stability to Pakistan. And I said, you have no idea what you're talking about. Yes, it'll bring stability insofar as it'll be controlled by Beijing. But fundamentally, this is a China game. And now, after a year, they've accepted that, yes, this is a straightforward power grab. But it's going to be a very extensive battle. When I talk to people on the Indian side at the highest level, I said, what is our fundamental geopolitical battle going to be this century? They said it's for the control of the Indian Ocean. The Chinese are very clear. Indian Ocean cannot be India's ocean. And in this century, it will be a Chinese one.
Okay, very well put. I think there are 3 more questions coming up, and we will close with that for lunch. Let us start with you, Gautam.
Thank you. Wonderful to hear Pramit and Professor Karnad, and of course Pawan's one-liners. So I just want to make a comment and then a question. So comment is that I think India's economy is growing, and so of course we are being noticed. So I think this Doklam, and you talked about Doklam. I think Doklam was, in my view, China's way of assessing what is India capable of, or because everybody's talking about India. So I think this is their way of assessing what India can do and so that is my impression, and I could be wrong. Second thing is, I'm a little not in agreement with Professor Karnad here, where you said that military power is the one. Now, in my opinion, when you have the adversaries around you, And unless you are most powerful, there will always be somebody who will be more powerful than you in some aspect. So if you are willing to control military power by military power, we have a problem. So one way to do it is, of course, you need to have a military power balance so that they don't do harm to you, but you add with other powers like economic, or like you said, soft powers of Bollywood or any other power. So my question to you is that in terms of China is like when you go to a new office or a new school or a new environment, there are always some known bullies or well-known peoples of gang lords of that area. How do you deal with them? So do you deal only with weapon power? I don't think so. So there'll be other things. So I just wanted your view on that.
Yeah. I never said that hard power is the way to go up against China. What I've said is a very targeted, calibrated use of hard power. It doesn't mean, I mean, for one thing, for instance, what did I say earlier? If you keep the context in mind, the Indian state spends less than the last 2 or 3 years, it's been less than 1.75% of the GDP. Less than 1.75% of the GDP on military. And then we misuse it on the wrong capabilities. That's the point I was trying to make. I thought I made that clear in terms of developing our capabilities vis-a-vis Pakistan and leaving the China front exposed in a way. The whole point about shifting resources from the strike corps, the armor mechanized, into offensive mountain corps, which is what I recommended. And it's first getting to now with the first offensive corps coming in. And then Arun Jaitley last year said we couldn't afford the mountain offensive corps because it cost too much, 64,000 crores. That's too much. Naturally, if you misuse your resources by spending on something you'll never use on the Western Front, with and at the expense of a mountain corps that would be useful in giving you an offensive option on the Tibetan Plateau, to give a pause for thought to the Chinese. That's the whole idea. It's wise use of resources. Hard power is absolutely essential. I'm not saying it's the only thing. I'm saying that use hard power as the cutting edge. Use a soft power to ease your edge in. That's how powers use it. That's how powers use hard power. And again, just one little thing on the Chabahar, because I have to point out that this is what I mean by all talk and no action. If you recall, we talked about the Ganges-Mekong connectivity, remember? As far back as 2002. What's happened to it? We are unable to connect with Myanmar, for God's sake. Come on. In the same time, 2 years later is when the Chinese formally talked about the connectivity that they had on, they were talking about, which they have now realized. Inside of 16 years, they now have a rail track running to Liverpool. They'll have CPEC if they get a clear run within 3 years. Gwadar port is already operating. Now, the good thing about Chabahar, which you never recognize, is it's just 70 kilometers upwind of Gwadar. Had we gone ahead full speed on Chabahar, and you just, as in everything else, dilly-dally, just stopped, prevaricated, and lost the Iranian confidence, what would we have done? We would have set up our naval base, which was part of the whole deal, by the way, to outflank the Chinese presence in Gwadar. Right? Now, but I don't know what happens to the government of India. Nothing happens in real terms. So the connectivity that we're talking about, the north-south corridor, is just on paper. Now we have a skeletal framework, it's true, and that's why we have just sent the first consignment. Actually, the first consignment was sent 2 years back. This is just something that we are playing out as something new. So there's nothing there. More than 3, I mean, it's 4 or 5 years back, honestly. The first consignment, reconsignment to Afghanistan went then. So there's, so had we built Chabahar fully, the north-south corridor, by the way, was to connect up with Russia's northern distribution network, NDW. That would have connected us to St. Petersburg well before the Chinese had realized the Liverpool rail track. Why do we mess up so much? We squander opportunities by the basketful all the time. And then we wonder why it is that we are not going ahead in the world.
Good point. Last two questions, General Khurana. General Khurana.
Thank you. Bharat, my question is for you. And I'll take the last bit that you said just now, that we've got to be militarily strong, we've got to execute, we've got to put things into practice, put them on the ground. But then you say that we should have a composite corps against, an offensive corps against Chinese, which I'm totally with you. Now I speak from mind, I'm a pre-47 man. I have served 40 years in the army and I'm from Punjab. So therefore I think pathologically, I know the Pakistani mind. Pakistani mind forever is going to stay anti-Indian. Pakistani mind forever is going to look at places where they can pinprick us. And if we take Kargil as an example, from a few posts where they had come in, as to what effort went in to evict them. Therefore, I come to your recommendation that we should demobilize the three corps on the Pakistani front and have a composite corps sitting somewhere, react against it. A lot of us think we've got nuclear weapons, so has Pakistan got. But since 45, nobody's used the nuclear weapons. Yet there have been a number of wars, regional wars all over the place. The point I'm coming to is that Pakistan would, if we were to demilitarize these three corps, which today is a huge deterrent, and the border being so long and plains border, I'm not talking so much about Kashmir, which is a different point of issue altogether. We've got to be strong on that border, not to let them be able to come in like they did even in Kargil. Because if that composite corps sitting somewhere, which you and me know, we've discussed it a number of times, I've had good discussions with you, I'm afraid that situation will probably be worse than having these three corps. But why don't you say that we should, in addition, have strike capability? That's the point I'd like to make.
General, as an armor man, I suppose this is the real, if I may say so, part of the vested interest speaking. In the military bureaucracies, that armor, as you know, sir, is a very, very powerful combat arm. I remember way back, there's just an anecdotal thing, and it's just a thing to bring in a little bit of jollity into the discussions here. Jaswant Singh, who was Central India Horse, also ex-cavalry armor. In 1996, I think, or 1997, he gave the USI National Lecture, annual lecture. If you read the lecture, you'll find him saying that you have to demobilize two strike corps to get the first time, incidentally, that someone of such responsibility was saying this. Now, immediately after the talk, he was surrounded by senior cavalry generals, and I'm not sure whether you were there amongst them, and they berated him in a very, very strong way, his seniors in service, and to whom he deferred. And Jaswant was, well, what's wrong with you? Why are you saying these things publicly? Don't you understand what this means, etc. And of course, the very bold and courageous Jaswant said, yeah, he wrote the speech, and he pointed to me. Right? Of course, he was being jocular, and he was just trying to ease off the pressure. But the point to make is really more serious. In all the years that we have had the three strike corps, and before the three strike corps, the various squadrons and regiments and the entire armored and mechanized fleet, how far did we penetrate into Pakistan before nuclear weapons? You know, as far as, as well as I do, that in real terms, and I'm not talking about the Rahim Yar Khan, where you went a little distant because there's nothing there, and it's awfully good armor territory, because there's absolutely nothing. Yeah, but you can't do that in the Punjab plains. The nearest that you got was Dogra with Colonel Desmond Hayde in 3 yards during the 65 war. You didn't push ahead. That was a problem. I remember someone like the army, Western Army chief at the time, Harbaksh, telling me, and I actually have him on record, on a tape somewhere, telling me, and I should write this history sometime, I have other interests, but Harbaksh was telling me, getting so upset with the Shastri government not providing him aerial cover. You know the story. Or Dogra. Because he actually, and I sort of ribbed the general saying that you are trying to be the new avatar of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and he sort of shoo-shooed me up and he said, look, I could have taken Lahore. I was stopped from taking Lahore. He believed it. And if you look at the Pakistani side, they were not prepared for it. We waited for 3 days. Had we pushed ahead, we actually would have taken Lahore. But then, and this is the important thing, had we taken Lahore in 65, let's say, the ifs of history, had we taken the Lahore in 65, Pakistan would have fallen apart. You would have undone partition. And then what? Then what is, you would have had a perennial recipe for civil war. Perennial civil war. I'm sorry. This is the larger political context in which the decision was made in Delhi not to provide aerial cover to the army thrust, the infantry thrust along with armor. So the idea was never to dismantle Pakistan. For God's sake, if you think about it in geostrategic terms, if Pakistan weren't there, we'd have to invent it. Because it provides us a buffer state against the very influences we now see that have taken over Pakistan. The Islamic influences, the extremism, which if you read the Pakistani press or just talk to any Pakistani, that's the thing they say. We have become victims of our own, shall we say, wrong thinking and wrong policies. So we have to be very careful. Pakistan is an asset if only we realize it. And if, in our wisdom in the future, we were to build up, in some sense, make it a real buffer, a real cordon sanitaire, it would help us, our security, not for the sake of Pakistan, for our own security. I think we need to ensure that Pakistan is secure. And that way, we'll also then fend off China coming into Pakistan. This is the sort of thinking we should think of in larger terms.
How insightful and how wise. There are more hands going up. It's time, Siddharth. Do we have a time for 2-3 more questions or 1 more question?
I just want to make a comment,
fine.
actually.
Quickly,
Yeah.
quickly, please.
Okay, the reason why I said is because the 2 issues that got debated were really related to military. I'm General Sani. I just retired as the CNC last year from Jaipur. I've also been the Corps Commander who looked after the area in Arunachal. So I'd like to just put 2 or 3 issues in perspective because it's a hall full of very serious and very senior opinion makers. Firstly, as far as Doklam is concerned, let me just put it in 2 matters. Today, out of that 4,000 kilometers, there are 12 disputed identified areas, which is an open domain. We have a lot of patrolling that happens there. And let me just tell you, there are over 200 intrusions that we do to areas which we think are ours as per the defensive line as far as India is concerned, and a similar amount, about maybe 1/3 the amount done by the Chinese. We have standoffs that happen. Why was Doklam different and why was it separate? I'm sure it did get passed on or it did get implied. Doklam was important because India stood up and held the hand which was implied by the speaker to the right of Mr. Bharat Karnad, whom I know very well and I get a chance to speak to him. But it was done because we held the hand of Bhutan and honored a treaty that existed. So the issue was, it actually pointed fingers at the other nations who haven't been able to do the same in the South China Sea. And maybe this activity that has happened quite often. You've had it in Demchok, you've had it in Arunachal, it happened in the area of, there are loads of instances. But standoffs, as per our CBM measures, you don't establish contact and do a standoff, you try and avoid it. But where it happens, you generally end up with a 1 and 2 months is quite a regular feature that happens. These came up into place. So Doklam has to be looked at the fact that this was a perspective with the third nation, and tactical actions and directions by the present government are quite clear, it seems, that the military leaders at the ground can take action as they deem fit. So I mean, that is how I would say Doklam should be looked at. The second issue as far as restructuring of forces, I think I won't get into debate of strike cause required, not required, because I don't think that's the issue. But I'll bring to the greater picture, leave it to the military specialists to decide how restructuring of forces needs to be done. And this is where the problem of national security in India is. We've got military analysts. There are very few people like us who tend to sort of come into this domain to start speaking. The national security has three dimensions. You have the economic and the external dimension. Let it be a foreign policy guy. Let there be a guy from the economic sector. There's an internal dimension. Let there be a police guy. And let there be an external dimension. Please take the experts on board who will be able to share with you who are sitting on the borders. Because today, sitting here, as you're aware, the problem on the northern borders is not of restructuring and putting forces. That has been thought of. The problem is you don't have the infrastructure. We are 180 kilometers from the borders, which you say is to be governed by you. And it was only in 2005-06 that you finally had the government at that time deciding to make the roads across the border. Why? Because of the statement of 1962 everybody keeps talking. I'm sorry, is the economic situation of India like the 1940s or 50s? No. So how do you draw parallels to that? So today, every time you talk about the Chinese, we fall back to 1962. It's a wrong peg mark to start talking about things. You talk from 1971, you'll get greater resonance and action and thought process. So I mean, I won't preach in this, but I would say there is a need for military analysts to see how restructuring needs to be done. What are the focus areas? Just don't sort of delete issues and wipe them off the spectrum because it's required or not required. So the third thing which I would like to just highlight is more and more forums I'm seeing, I'm getting a chance to also interact with him at an opportunity with some of the track twos and with the Chinese universities and other places. I think the worry what I'm finding is that in India, we as analysts tend to talk about India, Japan, US, Australia as a bloc. I don't think India has never been part of a bloc, but I think the resonance in our media and in our speech is as if we are getting into a bloc. Let me tell you, we started doing exercises with the Chinese at the same time as we started with the US. We started doing exercises with the Russians much before that. So I think India has never been part of a bloc. And this resonance that we find in the intellectual forums of it becoming part of a bloc, I think is a little detrimental to the status and the standing of our nation. I think we need to look at it a little more pragmatically. And the last issue which I would like to leave out here was, I think, the continuity of policy, which was very aptly, I think, implied by Professor Karnad. I think undoubtedly the failure of India's strategic thought process has been the continuity in the thought process of continuing a policy, whether it's of appeasement, whether it's of engagement, whether it's of confrontation, whether it's of collaborative engagement. I think this is where we have failed. And I think political masters have to be educated by senior analysts like him who enjoy a great status to ensure that there is political continuity of thought process in India's national engagement with our neighbors. And I think that will result in much more better thing. Sorry for taking up the time, but as being a man in uniform who just retired recently, I had to put this in perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate this comment. Take it as a complimentary comment to what the speakers have spoken. There are more questions coming up, but hands going up, but please interact with the speakers during the lunch. Really sorry about this. I would just like to sum up the session by thanking Professor Karnad and Pramit. What a fine discussion and what a fine audience. Not only the generals, the CEOs and industry leaders also raised very good questions. What both the speakers agreed on was, one, that real politics is more important, not idealistic real politics or idealistic geopolitics. Second is team up with other countries, but do not only depend on the team, develop your own strength also. And the last point where you agreed, and I think not only you, but the rest of India and our neighboring countries also, you told us, Pramit, about this, that within the country, outside the country, in the neighborhood, they were complaining about all dispensations of our government, that they have not kept the promises. That is also applicable to us. But overall, this session says that real politics is the way to go, and speaking in a constructive manner, I feel that this government has done a huge job in the last 3.5 years. Let's compliment it and support it in every manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That was indeed a thought-provoking session. We will now break for lunch. During lunch, you have the opportunity to also interact with Mr. Gopal Krishna Agrawal and Mr. Nitin Pai, who've joined us. The next session, post-lunch, is really the cherry on the cake. A session on socio-political thought. Are we better off today, or was yesterday better? Where you will have Professor Madhu Purnima Keshwar, Mr. Nitin Pai, and Mr. Pavan Chaudhary talking about yesterday and today. So, have your lunch and the sparkling wine compliments from Moya and Shalon. Have your mousse and come back for the cherry. Thank you very much.